Hello, and thank you for joining me for the Dear Sam Help Horsemanship Series. So, this week I wanted to talk about pressure. Pressure is a big one, and I think there's a lack of awareness in humans in how they're using pressure, when they're creating pressure, and if we don't have this fundamental concept when we're interacting with the horse, we're often conveying a lot of unintentional information. So, in talking about terms of pressure, there's three different types of pressure when interacting with the horse. There is spatial pressure, as far as the proximity of your body, your energy, your movement relative to where the horse is at. There is physical pressure, which is any sort of touching the horse. This could be touching him through the use of your lead rope connected to a halter, which is on his head. It could be your rein pressure, it could be your seat, it could be your leg if you're sitting on him. And then there's also vocal pressure, which is where if you're using your voice to have a response or influence your horse. So typically we're using physical pressure and spatial pressure to communicate. And one of the things that I really want to drive home is how much of the time people are imposing themselves onto their horse, creating a significant amount of pressure without even realizing it. So something I want you to think about is how often do you have an emotional thought that says, I love my horse, I want to touch my horse, I want my horse to nestle his nose in my neck or wherever, and that you are physically getting close to your horse without ever actually acknowledging how your horse is communicating with his body in giving you feedback as to what he feels about you spatially coming in and then physically imposing yourself. And because often we have a emotional feeling behind what it feels like to be close to our horse, we don't really ever consider, but how does the horse feel about us physically imposing ourselves on them? And if you take a moment to think about maybe a scenario in life outside of horses where you had a person, maybe you were unfamiliar with them, maybe you were familiar with them, and they started to come close to you, maybe with a lot of energy, or maybe just whatever their personality was, and it caused you some bother, some concern, or you weren't totally friendly with them, and they continued to force themselves into your personal space, or maybe even going in for a hug or whatnot, and that became really uncomfortable for you. I see this all the time that happens with horses. So there is this idea that because we can catch the horse, because the horse allows us to ride him, that he allows us to do all of these unnatural things, that at any point, at any time, I can walk in and impose myself on the horse. And if it feels like it is an imposition where we are forcing ourselves spatially and physically onto the horse, then we have missed something. So a big key in looking about refining the equine partnership is having these what I call two-way conversations. And you're going to hear me talk about this word a lot, and I call it conversations because it should not feel like a dictatorship. Although you are going to be in the thinking and proactive and delegating, here's where I need my horse's thought, here's where I need his movement, here's how I influence his energy, we still have to be receptive to hear the horse's expressing of himself as far as if there's concern, if there's worry, if there's fear, if there's defensiveness, and any other emotions or mental distractions that then causes physical resistance. So one of the things I want you to think about as far as when you are imposing pressure upon your horse, how does he feel about it? And I can't tell you how many times there are horses that seem to be quite successful and far along in their training or even competing or whatnot. Doesn't really matter the tack or the equipment or the discipline. And it seems like things are mostly going well. And, the riders are looking to refine. And I walk up and just taking a solid feel with my hand on the lead rope, not pulling, not yanking, not dragging. And that horse immediately throws his head up and looks to, if you will, imagine pull backwards, pull away from the pressure of my hand. That's that initial indication that something major has been missed. So as much as the horse has tolerated a imposition of physical pressure of tack and equipment on him, or the rider being on him, or being handled from the ground, there is a very clear line that if pressure is created in a direct and specific way, it is creating a defensiveness in the horse. And if he is carrying this at all times, then what happens as we try and ride in a specific and intentional manner? We're probably triggering more defensiveness in the horse without even realizing it, because in our mind, we're thinking he's accepting of the tack, he's accepting of the rider, he's accepting of, these different places that I ride him in, or these different things that I ask of him, and he hasn't done anything that bad, which is always people's low standard of if a ride is successful or not, rather than saying, you know what, if I start to get very specific with this horse, whether it's using the lead rope from the ground or a rein and directing his thought before you ask for movement from it when you're in the saddle, gee, he really physically locks up his body with a brace, with a defensiveness. I've missed something here. I need to stop. I need to do a timeout, and I need to check in and say, where are the places that there's holes in our communication that we've missed? And this is one of those things where when things aren't going well, the irony is often the horse is defensive towards the human creating spatial pressure or physical pressure, and then they are often taught, add more pressure in order to fix it. Well, again, if you think back to that scenario where you had someone maybe physically imposing themselves into your personal space or asking you to do something that you didn't feel comfortable with, and then they added more pressure and they intensified their request, or they intensified the pressure they were creating, you'd probably get pretty upset and bothered and frustrated and defensive. And the next time you saw that person, you'd be coming into it remembering those past experiences. And this is how humans unintentionally continuously teach horses to be defensive towards pressure, because they don't address the initial indications in showing whether it was missed in the horse's education when he first was introduced to humans and all of this foreign equipment and tack and things that we use, or whether the way in which pressure was used, physical pressure through constant driving, that there was no release from the pressure, there was no acknowledgement of try from the horse, and we basically create a defensive horse, and then we have no options. Because if the horse is mentally defensive and resistant, then physically towards pressure, he will either pull back or try and get away. And so you'll feel him, the horse who grabs the bit and dives to the ground, the horse who's heavy on your hands, the horse who you barely do anything in the saddle and he's overreacting in his movement, the horse who seems fine in the area that he's familiar in riding in, and you ride somewhere else that is a new pressure, a new location, a new space, and it feels like all of a sudden he comes unglued or he has a meltdown. These are all indications that your horse has had something missed in how he's translating pressure, and we need to go back to the basics, which nobody likes to hear, nobody wants to address, but it's unavoidable if we want to actually fill in this hole that's been missed. Whether we weren't aware of it, that's okay. We can always go back and fill it in and refine that and build that solid foundation. But if we don't, and we continue to ask more of our horse, we're just creating more pressure. And then the day that our horse becomes physically unreasonable or physically dramatic or potentially dangerous, and we go, well, he's never done that before, we haven't realized that all of these past interactions in the way in which we are presenting and using pressure has contributed to that horse's, we'll call it the proverbial emotional cup, filling and filling and filling until one day, all of a sudden, he explodes. So maybe take a few minutes, slow down, and we're going to start to assess, how does your horse feel about pressure? In the next episode, we're going to talk about what are ways that your horse will physically be communicating to you, to explain how it is that you can recognize and break down the feedback your horse is giving you and where there might be some holes. So thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you next Friday.